woman who survived the Johnstown flood. Maybe you've heard about her, but after she survived the Johnstown flood, all she wanted to do was to give lectures about it. So at any opportunity, when anybody said, "What would you like to do?" she said, "Well, of course, give a lecture on the Johnstown flood." And in due course, at the end of a happy and productive and active life lecturing, she died and of course went to heaven. And when she got to heaven, she was asked by one of the angels that she was told that she had one wish. And what would that one wish be? That they would grant one wish. And of course her one wish was that she would like to give a lecture on the Johnstown flood. And they said fine, and they gathered up all the angels and archangels, and they all gathered before her, and she was about to start her lecture, and they were all in, you know, sort of toga-like, you know, outfits, as whatever angels wear in heaven, I don't know, whatever they wear. And she was in a similar kind of outfit, and somebody at the last minute tugged on her toga and said, "I just thought you'd like to know that Noah is in the audience." Well, I feel as though I'm giving a lecture on the Johnstown flood with an awful lot of Noahs in the audience. So I know that I am talking before and with a group of people who know a great deal about the topic that I've been looking into, and I want to compliment you on your work, your activism, your caring, and your struggle against the many problems that we're having in our society. And even though there are an awful lot of Noahs in the audience, I will plunge in anyway. What I'd like to do tonight is tell you a little about the research that I've done on hate incidents or bias incidents or whatever we want to call them on college campuses over the past decade. I became aware of the rash of incidents, which I'm sure you all know about, across the country, and decided that it was something worth looking into. You probably know that the National Institute Against Prejudice and Violence estimated, for example, that between the fall of 1986 and the winter of 1990, there were hate incidents at virtually all kinds of colleges across the country. They defined these incidents as campus, quote, campus ethno-violence, which covers the spectrum of violent acts, including potentially lethal assaults, classroom and dormitory harassment, personal insults, graffiti, property damage, and so forth. They claimed, and I quite agree, and I think we all agree, that these incidents include racist, sexist, homophobic, and anti-Semitic incidents, and range from repeated harassment to one-time remarks which might be offensive to some, but might even be considered humorous by others. So there's a tremendous range of these incidents that have taken place. Now, an interesting question is, are these hate incidents violent? Obviously, physical violence is violent, but is hate speech a form of violence? Is hate graffiti a form of violence? Is sexual harassment a form of violence? And as one way of answering those questions, I'd like to quote Toni Morrison's lecture. I'm sorry. Okay? You mean the mic needs to be louder? Okay. See if it's okay. I'd like to quote Toni Morrison's lecture at the time that she received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1993. And she said at that time, "Oppressive language does more than represent violence." Toni Morrison said, "It is violence. Does more than represent the limits of knowledge, it limits knowledge. And I feel that she is quite right, that Toni Morrison is right in saying that hate speech is a form of violence, and of course does limit knowledge. Now, as many of you may remember, these incidents really began, or they began so that we started to hear about them, at least, at Dartmouth in the early 1980s. In the now infamous Dartmouth Review, which was actually edited by Dinesh D'Souza, who has since become one of the primary authors on the topic of political correctness, etc., on college campuses. He was actually the editor of the arch-conservative Dartmouth Review in the early 1980s. And in 1982, they kicked off a series of incidents at Dartmouth by parodying black English and mocking and deriding black students at Dartmouth. Another incident that I think virtually everybody who was interested in these issues heard about was at the University of Michigan in 1988, when a poster was put up which took off on the United Negro College Fund slogan and read, "Support the KKK College Fund. A mind is a terrible thing to waste, especially on a nigger." If we move ahead to 1992, we see that in Princeton they did a survey of incidents on the Princeton campus during that year, and they found that people were experiencing the following kinds of incidents. One student said, "I've been told to go back where I came from. I've been called a chink. I've been told that they should have kept my parents in concentration camps during World War II." Another student said, "A fellow first-year student said God knows how many qualified whites were left out because of quotas like you." Yet another student said, "I've been the butt of a couple of Jewish jokes, but I wouldn't say that's harassment." And yet another one, "I've seen posters in the Woodrow Wilson School defaced with racial slurs and the harassment of black faculty." But it's not been all racist incidents. Anti-Semitic incidents have risen markedly, more than doubled between 1988 and 92. And of course, gay bashing is virtually everywhere. Perhaps one example indicates the tone of some of the gay bashing that's been going on campuses in recent years. At Syracuse University, a fraternity was suspended by its national organization in 1991 by selling T-shirts with anti-homosexual slogans, including one advocating violence against gays. On the front, the shirt said, "Homophobic and proud of it." And on the back, it said, "Club faggots, not seals." The picture illustrating the words was of a muscled crow, the fraternity's symbol, holding a club and standing over a faceless figure lying on the ground. Next to them is a seal hoisting a mug of beer. And of course, as gay bashing has been ubiquitous, so has sexual harassment, which has run the gamut from a nude centerfold from Penthouse attached to a student's doorway in a dorm, to a fraternity at George Mason University in Virginia in 1991 that held an ugly woman contest and at the same time denigrated women and African Americans, to the violent, sadistic songs, marching songs sung at the U.S. Naval Academy and also at UCLA, which told in vivid terms, actually too vivid for me to read to you here. I would not be comfortable, it is so harsh and so vivid, about using and abusing women. And finally, of course, we've all heard about the incidents of rape on college campuses, largely campus rape, occasionally gang rape, which has been, by the way, most movingly written about by an anthropologist Peggy Sanday. So that we know that this has all been going on over the last decade. And of course, what's interesting is what exactly is going on. Why are these incidents happening? Now, what's also interesting is how the media has portrayed what's been happening. Largely, the media has portrayed colleges as almost walled-off city-states, separate from the rest of society. But we know that this isn't true. We know that colleges are an extension of society and often reflect some of what's going on in society. We know that over the past decade, there has been an increase in immigration. We know that that has brought a tremendous backlash against immigrants, which, of course, so disturbingly, is being indicated by the popularity of Proposition 187 in California. So that we know a backlash against immigrants is certainly very much present in our society. We also know that anger and alienation is very present, that we have that we have had over the last decade and continue to have significant economic problems. Even though they tell us that things are improving, and in some places they may be, we hear of the layoff of thousands of workers from company after company. Many of these workers, longtime employees, union employees, or middle management, people who are fearful that they're not going to find another job comparable to what they had, that their standard of living will indeed drop, that the future will not be as good as the past has been, if the past has been at all decent at all, and that even, perhaps most important, that their children will not have the standard of living that they did. So I think that there is great fear of the future going on in this society. And of course, during the Reagan years, we had the bashing of the poor, systematic bashing of the poor, and of course of people of color. Under George Bush, the infamous Willie Horton ad, and many other examples of the subtle and not so subtle ways in which poor people and people of color were demeaned. And of course, we see scapegoating and violence against people of color, particularly in the larger society. And what's incredible is that with these problems going on in our country, with the gap between rich and poor greater than it has ever been since we have been gathering these data, the people we are blaming for our problems are the poor and the relatively powerless. It's an incredible trick that somebody has put over on the American people. Let me give you a vignette from a very interesting book which illustrates this characteristic of blaming the powerless instead of the powerful for some of the problems that people are feeling in the society. This is from a book by Chandler Davidson about politics in Texas. And it's a very interesting book. And this is the entire quote. Chandler Davidson is writing. These are two men who are standing waist deep in a pool in an apartment development in the middle of Houston, Texas, talking. Bob stared at his beer can for a moment and then savagely, to no one in particular, he said, "That son of a bitch Reagan put me out of a job. That's who did it." Al stiffened. "Wait a minute," he said. "You're talking about my man now. You're talking about my man." "I don't care if he's your man. That son of a bitch is the reason I'm standing in this goddamn pool tonight, drunk on my ass." "Just a minute," he said. "You don't talk about the president like that. To hell with the president." "Listen, Bob," Al said, suddenly calm. "You've got it all wrong. You've got it all wrong. You want me to tell you who's taking your job away? You really want to know?" Bob glared at him. "It's the goddamn niggers who work for lower wages, and it's those goddamn wetbacks. That's who's taking your job. You can't blame that on Reagan." Bob was silent for what seemed to be a long time, staring straight at Al. "Now you're talking sense," he said finally. "Now you're talking something that I can relate to. You've put your finger on something now." And indeed, that's how many people come to see the problems in the larger society as being the fault of those without power and very often without resources. Now, in my thinking about these issues, it struck me that what has been missing from the discussion of multiculturalism and diversity and PC being discussed ad nauseum is the impact of these incidents on the students themselves. What's been missing are stories and analyses about the pain, the conflict, the coping mechanisms, if you will, on students and the impact students have had and continue to have on their campuses. So what I set out to do during the academic years 1991-92 and 92-93 was to talk to students at a variety of campuses across the country. I talked with over 100 students and with faculty and administrators at 17 colleges and universities, both public and private, large and small, urban, suburban, maybe a couple were even almost rural. It's hard for those of us in New York City to actually get rural, but we try. I talked with a diverse group of students, obviously white and African American and Latino and Asian American and a couple of Native American students, tried to diversify the students somewhat by class, certainly by gender, by sexual orientation, and all the rest. Most of it was single interviews, but when they were colleges in the New York City area, even in the metropolitan New York City area, many times I went back and back and back, and the interviews were a product of 3 or 4 times meeting with an individual student. Now, obviously, I cannot give a clear picture of what's going on at any college or university from the interviews I got. What I can do is try to give some picture of how what was going on their college campus was affecting those students at that time in that place. Now, let me just say a word about the obvious in a sense, but what the students have to face. Most of the students that I interviewed were traditional college age. Even though more and more students are returning students or older students, most of the students I interviewed were between the ages of 17 and 18 and say their middle 20s. This is the first time they have probably left home for any length of time. This is the time they have to define themselves. They have to figure out who they are. They have to figure out their worth. They have to figure out their interests. They have to figure out who and what they are and what they can do. And I think that it's a very important time, obviously, in their lives. And we know that all of our identities are shaped by our family, by our community, by our educational opportunity, perhaps even to some degree by our physical appearance, but also by our ascribed membership in a variety of groups that we have no control that we are members of. The ethnic group we're born into, the religious group that we are born into, the racial group that we are part of, our sex, and our class. And how those groups are viewed by the larger society, I believe, become very important to how individuals, particularly young individuals who are still developing their notions about their own identity, see themselves. Moreover, many students come to college from relatively homogeneous communities. We live in a very segregated world. Many of us live in very segregated neighborhoods and go to segregated schools. We are not familiar with people who are different than we are. Students make this journey, which may be only a mile or two or maybe across the country, to college and come face to face with people who are very different than they are, who may have different customs, who have different color skins, who may have different ways of expressing themselves. And I think it's often extraordinarily difficult in the climate in which we're all living in this society for them to cope with some of these differences. Now, one of the ways in which the media has portrayed these incidents is extraordinarily simplistically. Students have often been pictured as ready to confront at the least offense, charging in to make their claims heard. A nation of victims we hear about, with everybody complaining about their victimhood. This is not what I found at all. I think it's been grossly overstated. What I found is that many of the students that I interviewed were very anxious and ambivalent about confrontation. Marcella, for example, and all the names have been changed to protect the innocent. Marcella is a student at Hunter College in New York, where I teach. She was her family was from Southern Europe originally. She has dark hair and not very fair skin. And she feels that she has been taken at Hunter, where there are many Latina students. She feels she has often been mistaken for a Latina. She went to an advisor in the English department to ask about the master's program in English. The advisor didn't ask her about her academic record, which was superb. She didn't ask her whether she belonged to whether she was part of the Honors Society at Hunter, the Honors Program at Hunter, which is very selective, which she is. She asked her nothing about her academic work. The advisor instead cautioned her and warned her that this program was very difficult indeed, and that perhaps she should look for something else. Marcella was convinced it was because she was thought to be a Latina woman. Marcella also talks about many of the homophobic references that she hears everywhere she goes. She is a lesbian and very sensitive to these kinds of issues. She talks about how she feels about hearing some of these homophobic incidents and what she feels she must do about it. Most of the time she says, I want to speak out, but fear keeps me back. It's scary, but most of the time I don't want to run away from speaking out. But you know, there is also a power imbalance in the situation. They are professors, and I am a student. She goes on to talk about an incident that happened recently, right before we had talked. I was at a conference on gay and lesbian issues not too long ago, and the woman signing in front of me said, in response to a question from a guard, "No, I'm straight, thank God." I didn't say anything. A colleague of mine constantly uses the word faggot as a generic swear word. I want to say, how do you know that? How do you know about his sexuality? She is using the most despicable word she can think of, but I haven't said anything. Do you have to speak up all the time? She goes on to say, I wasn't raised to confront. With each incident, I have to think, to confront or not to confront. It's like talking back, she says. I wasn't raised to talk back. It's not part of my culture. So despite what the newspapers and the television programs may tell us, the students aren't all out there screaming and confronting. Many of them are worried about exactly what their role should be and are very uncomfortable confronting people in positions of power with these kinds of incidents, which happen all the time. Just by the way, I did not talk to one student, whether he or she be white or from any other background, whether their politics were left or right, and I did talk to some people who had right-wing politics, I need to say quickly. I did not talk to one student who had not experienced some kind of a bias incident. So it's everywhere, and they are not comfortable knowing how to deal with it. Another student in New York City at Barnard College, Rebecca Tao, talks about anti-Semitism at Barnard College in the middle of New York City. She talks about the anti-Semitism of speakers invited to Barnard, sometimes invited by the Black Student Organization at Columbia. Barnard is the women's college affiliated with Columbia. She talks about how she felt when these speakers speak at Columbia. She says, I hate this man, she's talking about Leonard Jeffreys, a professor from City College, who came and spoke for 3 hours straight and didn't allow any questions. And at the end, in his speech, what offended her the most is that he said that he had been, the only fraternity at college he had been admitted to was a Jewish fraternity, and eventually he became president of that fraternity for 2 years. And what offended her the most was that he said that he became king of the Jews for 2 years. She says, I hate this man. I hate him because he hates me. He states that everything originated in black culture. I consider myself very Jewish, but I try not to hate anyone. My grandparents were survivors of the Holocaust, and I've never felt this way before in my life. My best friend who lived next door while I was growing up was not Jewish, but she never made me feel different. It took until junior year for me to feel that I am different and that people hate me for it. She goes on to talk about how she copes with these kinds of incidents at Barnard, and I think what she has to tell is very interesting. She says, I feel, and she's a senior by the time I'm talking to her, I feel like an insider here. I feel very comfortable walking around. I feel like it's my school. I'm very lucky. My religion gives me a strong commitment. It gives me some place to go to. Even freshman year, when I felt like an outsider, it gave me a place to belong. She goes on to say, it doesn't have to be a religious or ethnic group. It can be people on your hallway freshman year. But it's very important to have a group. The way Rebecca coped with the anti-Semitism that kept surfacing at Barnard was to be part of a group where she felt comfortable, where she could go back at the end of the day and feel at home, feel like an insider within that group. We've all read the articles and the stories and the books talking about the self-segregation of minorities on college campuses. I suggest that what they are doing is some of what Rebecca was trying to do, find a safe place in what is often a hostile world, and that the retreat may not indeed be the beginning of the cycle, but may be an effect of hostility on college campuses. So that some students, Asian American students, told me, at the end of the day, we want to eat the kind of food we like. We want to cook it together. Maybe we want to talk in Korean or Chinese or Japanese. What's wrong with that, they said. They were aware that it was being criticized everywhere, but felt that it was important at the end of a day of mixing with everybody on a college campus to be able to go back to a group where you felt relatively safe and comfortable. Another student, Janet Greenleaf, 22-year-old student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, part of the Oneida tribe, a Native American who actually was chosen by her tribe to be Miss Oneida, which I thought was kind of fun. She then competed all over the country with all the other Miss Oneidas to find out who was the Miss Oneida. She luckily, in some sense, she didn't make it because then she came back to college and went back to her education. She talked about the bias against Native Americans on the University of Wisconsin campus. She talked about the anger. She talked about the fury. She talked about the epithets. She talked about not being served in restaurants when everybody else in the restaurant was served except the group she was with. And then she talked about how she felt about being at the receiving end of that kind of anger and how she didn't want to be part of she did not want to take on the anger. She said, you try not to get geared in that mode of thinking. It can get real negative. She said, whites see a drunk Indian and say all Indians are drunks. I don't want to hate a whole group of people. During a recent anti-Columbus march, I could hear the hatred toward white people. They are doing exactly what they are screaming others are doing to them. She goes on to say how she tries to resist the anger, tries not to feel the hatred. But she talks about the problems from the perspective of somebody who comes from a very different culture than the majority culture on the college campus itself. and how she has to be part of the culture she comes from and the culture she is moving into. And she says it, I think, beautifully. She says, I feel I am walking in two worlds. We have to keep the traditions alive, but we have to make money to survive in society. We can't blame everything on the past. People get caught as victims. We've got to get out of that. We must learn to cope with both worlds. Some will say, once you step into the other world, you can never come back. They stress that we should get an education and afterward come back to help our people, but then they are hesitant to let you back. Someone who has been gone has new ideas, and they don't necessarily want new ideas. They lose some type of trust in you once you've left. Now they think that you think like a white person, and you're trying to balance both worlds without losing yourself. So Janet talks about how she doesn't want to take on the anger and hate in return, and how somehow she's got to balance both cultures and both worlds. It's not easy for any of them. And then there's Robert Jackson at the University of Washington in Seattle. Robert Jackson was a very interesting student. He's a little older than most of the students I interviewed. He was 26 when I interviewed him. He had been, well, let me let him describe himself to you. He says, I was older than the average student. I had spent several years working and I was looking for something else. When I first came here, I felt I could work with white students. I came here very moderate, very unsuspecting. I was called an Uncle Tom and a house nigger, but I was just trying to be a righteous person. I wouldn't write someone off until I tried to work with that person. I wouldn't write someone off just because they were white. I never considered myself a student leader, he goes on. I didn't want to be a target. When I first came here, there was a racist incident. I didn't go to the rally that was organized, but I wanted to help, you know, with the flyers. Then I found I was doing the work, and then I was in charge. After several racist incidents on that campus, which probably you know even more about than I, a committee of the Senate formed and tried to figure out what to do to counter the racism that was being expressed in that campus. And of course, as you know all too well, it was being encouraged by white supremacists in the area and was quite fierce for a period of time. The Committee of the Faculty Senate came up with a proposal, a resolution, that all students taking a BA degree be required to take one 5-credit course before they graduated on diversity, essentially. On racial diversity, or another religion, or a course around gender, or a course around sexual orientation, or a course around disability, and I'm probably leaving out a few, race, ethnicity, gender, religion, disability, etc. It did not have to be an extra course. It could be a course you were taking as part of your degree anyway. And this was the recommendation they came up with. And the Faculty Senate mobilized, and they organized, and they took a vote, and the vote was large enough, and they insisted on a referendum. And this had been going on for years, as I think Bill knows all too well. Finally, the referendum was taken, and as you can imagine, the referendum on one course, at Hunter it would be one 3-credit course. Some institutions it was one 5-credit course. The referendum was defeated, the requirement was defeated 921 to 434 with 26 abstentions. Robert Jackson had mobilized students to work on this for the better part of 2 years. After all the racist incidents, he decided to work in this direction with others on his campus who agreed with him and were trying to educate students about difference. After the referendum failed, A faculty member who had been working with these students said to me, "We convinced them, the students, to work within the system, to take the peaceful way, and they went along with that. But now they must be feeling very hurt, angry, and bitter. They must feel a bit sold out." Another professor who also worked on developing the requirement felt that after the referendum, the quote, her words, "the students were devastated. They had worked for years on this. When the results of the referendum were known," she said, she saw male students with big tears in their eyes. And then Robert talks to me about how he felt when the requirement was defeated. He felt that it was because of white supremacy, his words. He said, "No one ever told me there was a system of white supremacy. Racism, yes, but not white supremacy. I called my mom," he said, a hospital worker, "and asked her, 'Why didn't you tell me?' And she said, 'Because you wouldn't have believed me.' Do they think," he's still talking, "do you think they are protecting us in some way? It doesn't make sense. We all got suckered into believing that the success of the 60s, the efforts to integrate schools and jobs, signified liberation. But now what we have to do is forget about the past and build on the present. I never saw myself as a victim. I still don't see myself as a victim. But all this has made me more cynical. I am very angry. I try not to express it, but sometimes it boils over. It has been a transforming experience." Now, Robert Jackson's work at that point had failed. He still had some more credits to go, and he was going to eke them out because he said he wanted to rattle their cages just for another year or so. He wasn't finished yet. He was going to work more on that college campus. But I think that what he shows as Rebecca Taub bonded, to use a tremendously overused word, with people like her as a way of feeling more comfortable on her campus. Robert Jackson and tried to engage in what Todd Gitlin has called commonality politics, to reach across race, across religion, across age, across hierarchy between students, administrators, and faculty, across all groups to mobilize with people who agreed with him on a certain issue and to organize and make a difference that way. So Robert Jackson is illustrative of what has become known as commonality politics on college campuses, and is very common, even though we don't hear that much about it from the media. One more example. Francesca Wilkinson, a student at Tufts. Let her tell you about her first day at Tufts College Tufts University outside of Boston. "I was skipping through the dining hall with a white boy I've known since I was 4, and a frat boy said, 'Look at that nigger bitch with that white boy.' I hated it there the whole first semester. I went home every weekend I could. I was angry at everything. There were only 100 African Americans out of 4,800 students, and it angered me. It was the first time I had been in that kind of environment, and I had a real feeling of isolation. My roommate and I were the only people of color in the dorm. I felt like people were staring at me. A lot of freshmen had never been among black people before." I wondered with Francesca how she had wound up at Tufts. I have to say that I am originally from Boston, which some of you may have gathered from a remaining Boston accent. And, Tufts has a certain, one has a certain view of Tufts in Boston, and I sort of never quite would have seen Francesca at Tufts. So I said, "How did you get here? How did you get to Tufts?" She came from a school in Washington, D.C., an actually interesting experimental school, but, why Tufts was my question. She said vehemently, "I got conned." She said, "Tufts comes to my school and does their spiel. They throw the diversity thing around, and I said, that's it. That's the school for me. The admissions person told me to apply early and send the stuff directly to her. I had medium grades, pretty good SAT scores, and was an activist in high school. And I visited here and had a good time. But I really got conned. They pushed diversity, and I really believed it. So what happened to her then, after this first semester of feeling like the quintessential outsider? She withdrew. First she withdrew psychologically and somewhat academically, then she withdrew physically and dropped out for a semester. And then, because she had some terrific teachers who cared about her and whom she cared about and whom she trusted and who urged her to come back to college, she said, these are all her words talking, this is not my analysis, this is her analysis. Because of them and her connections with these teachers, she went back spring semester of her sophomore year and became extraordinarily active on the Tufts campus. She raised scholarship money for African American students. She led the fight to get fraternities off the campus because she felt they were so homophobic. And she fought for gay rights. Wasn't her issue specifically, but it was an issue she cared about. And finally, she focused on the issue of privilege. And let her tell you again how she felt about being an activist on that campus for the last, essentially, 2.5 years that she was there. My day starts at 8 a.m. and doesn't end until 1 or 2 in the morning. I've missed out on what college is all about, on the partying, the good times. It's more fun this year than the past 3 years, but being an activist has caused me a lot of pain, loneliness, and isolation. But at the same time, I've formed the most beautiful, lasting relationships. I don't know what else I would be doing. She goes on to say that even though her years at Tufts have been difficult and demanding, Francesca says emphatically that she would do it, quote, again and again and again. She says, I might change a couple of things along the way, but this has been the single most rewarding experience of my life. It has forced me to think in different ways. When I started, I felt no one could have it worse than me. But I have come to see my position of privilege, that I am middle class and educated, and my responsibility to use that really, really powerful privilege of education. And I think that Francesca is, of course, saying something that we all need to hear over and over again when we get discouraged, when we feel there is not too much hope, particularly difficult period, I think, now of our nation's history. But I think that we have to remember her other words that she said to me. She said, activism for me has been a matter of survival. She said, a matter of my survival and my group's survival. And indeed, of course, as you all know, better than I, activism is indeed a matter of survival, particularly now. And I think that what we have to learn, particularly from Robert and from Francesca, is reaching across the usual boundaries, the boundaries of race, of class, of gender, of sexual orientation, and making common cause in order to renew our faith that we can make a better society and in order to nourish one another. Now, if we go back for a minute to the campuses, obviously it's an enormously complex issue that needs enormously complex action and solutions. Colleges must act to make education more equitable at every level, not just at the college level, to recruit more people of color, more teachers of color, to make diversity a living thing on college campuses, to bring people together so they won't see each other by the color of their skins, but by what they really are like. Students must continue to be active and to speak out all the time against the injustices that they see. It isn't easy, but they must continue to do this and work actively also to bring people together and to try to improve the atmosphere. But of course, the society has a role to play, because unless the society becomes more equitable, none of this will change. We've got to lessen the gap between rich and poor. We must provide opportunity for everybody to have a decent life in this society and to have a decent education, for we know without that education, it will be virtually impossible to survive in the next century. But above all, I think we must stop blaming those who have least and recognize that our problems are systemic and need to be dealt with systemically. And as you all know, we must not let them scapegoat the poorest and the least powerful among us. And we must not let them turn black against white, middle class and working class against poor, religion against religion, straight against gay, old against young. And that's, I believe, what you in the Northwest Coalition have been fighting about all these years, and part of the reason I'm so privileged to be speaking with you tonight. Cornel West, some of you may know his writings, has said that it is self-love and love of others that is the only real way to generate a sense of agency among a downtrodden people. I wonder if he shouldn't have broadened that a bit and said that self-love and love of others is perhaps the only real way to create a sense of agency among any of us, not just among downtrodden people. A Latina feminist has said, "I change myself, I change the world." It was on a poster that I saw in Iowa, actually, wherever Iowa is. New Yorkers have this habit of not quite knowing where anything is outside of New York. But I was in Iowa, and I saw that poster, and I said, we could reverse it, and it would be just as true. I change the world, I change myself. And if I could just quote one more person, Simone de Beauvoir, who has said, "It is in the recognition of the genuine conditions of our lives that we gain the strength to act and our motivations for change." You in this room, you in the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment, surely know, unfortunately, the genuine conditions of our lives and have the strength to act and the motivation for change. I'm privileged to be with you tonight, and I look forward to working with you toward creating the kind of society that we all want in this country. Thank you. Thank you. Some of you may know I've spent a little time in China over the years, off and on, and the Chinese have a wonderful habit of applauding the audience because it is the audience that does the speaker honor, so I applaud you. I am happy to have any questions, comments, discussions. Again, our Chinese friends would say, comments and criticisms. I'm not sure they always wanted criticisms, but they always said it. But I truly, just, thoughts, comments, criticisms, whatever. Yes?
Specifically at college campuses where there was a tradition of working on these issues, for example, Oberlin College, or Quaker schools like Earl College,
I'll repeat. Did you all hear the question? Did I look specifically at colleges that had a tradition of working on these issues like Oberlin or Earlham or Quaker schools and so forth? No, I did not. And I purposely did not. I did not want to single out the best. I did not try to single out the worst, whatever that meant. Well, I guess I would have thought Dartmouth was one of the worst. I didn't try to single out, you know, from the edges. I really tried to go much more mainstream and, you know, schools that, I looked at some schools that were formerly all female. I looked at mostly co-ed. I looked at I mean, you know, I didn't want to look particularly at schools with a tradition of either liberalism, radicalism, or working on those issues specifically, because I just wanted to know what's going on out there.
Actually, I have to visit Oberlin graduate where Oberlin is in trouble on these issues.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yes, I've actually read some
So
of
I
it.
wondered if you...
I have to tell you, the speaker was saying that Oberlin's in trouble on these issues in spite of having a history of working on every place is, not every place is in trouble. A lot of places have been in trouble. I mean, luckily at the moment, Hunter's not in trouble, but we really are diverse, and we really are, you know, it's a different kind of a school. But you wouldn't believe that virtually every place has had real problems. But no, I didn't seek them out. Yes?
Are there people who are working on university campuses, for instance, with you, to try and solve their problems? Or are there any models that are working?
Well, it's a very tricky question. The question is, are there people working on campuses to try to solve these problems, and are there any models that are working? That's the tricky part. Of course, there are people working everywhere. I mean, virtually everywhere there are groups on the campuses working on these issues. Groups within administration, groups that cut across administration, faculty, and students. You know, they don't all have the same names, but they're trying to bring people together, and they're trying to have multicultural evenings, and they're trying to have speakers, and they're trying to have orientation sessions, which don't always go the way they want them to go. They're trying a variety, multicultural requirements like University of Washington rejected. Hunter, for example, I don't mean to be talking about Hunter, but it's an interesting example, put through a multicultural requirement of 12 credits, 4 courses that one has to take before graduation. Now, they can be courses you're taking anyway. One can be gender, one in non-European cultures, one in European cultures, and one in sexual orientation, disability, whatever, something. So the colleges are trying a variety of techniques. Are there models that are working? That's a much tougher question. I am not aware of any models that are working as such. I mean, there are some schools that, you know, get over some of these problems more easily or more quickly than other schools. Columbia, for example, had an extensive orientation for all incoming freshmen, first-year students. All that sexist language is still with us. First-year students. And it emphasized gay rights and minority rights and history and culture. And, you know, according to many students, there was a real backlash. Many students felt it was overdone. It's done by students. Some of the students are much more adept at doing it than others. Some students felt very threatened. I had a very interesting vignette, which I didn't want to talk too long, but a very interesting vignette of a young man, white Protestant man, from a suburb outside of Seattle, who wasn't planning to go to college at all, but was on the track team of his high school, was noticed by the Columbia, somebody on the Columbia track team, a coach, encouraged to apply to Columbia, went to New York, and was thrown in the middle of all this stuff that he had never imagined before. And he tells very movingly about feeling very threatened by that multicultural, multi-sexual orientation, or, you know, orientation. of feeling like, oh my God, I'm where am I? What is this? His world had been turned upside down. Took him a long time to feel as though he was someplace that he could survive at. So I think that even with wonderful intentions, some of these programs, may be creating some backlash. It's a very tricky issue. And I don't particularly know of any real models that can be exported yet. Other thoughts? Yes?
Earlier you mentioned the school that promoted the culture first, and the students got there, they found it to be a little different. I was going to saw WSU as being campus like that.
I'm sorry, what was the last part of it?
I was going to saw WSU to be a school promoting culture and not.
I really wish I could comment, but I have to tell you that I sort of just got off the plane, and I'm about to go back on the plane, and I apologize for that. But you have a beautiful campus, and I was really so excited coming from New England to see you even had foliage. I mean, we're very provincial in the East. What can I tell you? I thought only we had foliage. I looked and I said, wow, you've got really beautiful foliage. So to be honest, I really can't comment on anything but your foliage. I'm sorry.
You mentioned also, we've been studying in my class, that the group A represses group B, and group B is more likely to repress another group, like group C, not necessarily back group A to group C. I wonder why that is.
Wow. We have a sociologist sitting right here whom I should, I'd much rather defer. It certainly is a pattern, and it's what we what sociology is. I tell my students, my intro students in sociology is learning new words for stuff you already knew. Okay? I mean, I'm forever telling them about something they knew all too well, and I put the word up on the board. Okay, so this is obviously what we call scapegoating, and it's finding a group to blame for the problems that one is facing, the anxieties, the alienation, the whatever. And I think you're absolutely right that we pass it along. I mean, we do it individually. The breadwinner in a family gets yelled at by the boss and comes home and yells at the oldest child, who picks on the next child, who kicks the dog. And, it goes down the line. And I think that certainly is happening. And I think some of the conflicts that we see, particularly in New York, and perhaps you see here as well, I'm not as familiar with what's going on out here, but in New York, the conflicts between Asians and African Americans, which is terribly sad. And also in the East, the conflicts between African Americans and Jewish people, which is incredibly sad considering the years of working together that preceded all this. There's just no question that groups take it out on another group, and again, not on the people in power, because the people in power are unreachable. They're in Washington, they're in the state capitol, they're somewhere else, they're rich, they're powerful. We want to be like them, we don't want to attack them, unfortunately. And I think a lot of it is displacement from them to whoever is vulnerable right below wherever we are. Go ahead.
You said it's never going up to the more powerful.
Right.
Is there anywhere in the world at all that you see a group being racist to the higher group? I can think of South Africa off the top of my head, where the group in power is the racist group, but is there essentially the group that is not power is racist against the other group?
Well, I wasn't really limiting it to racism. What I was really doing is saying that what we are doing is displacing our anger and our fury about our own anxieties and what's going on in our lives to a group that's more powerless. That was really the nature of the quote that I read from, Al and Bob, I guess it was, standing in the pool in Texas. And I think that obviously in many other societies, they've, people who are dissatisfied mounted an attack on those in power, and we call that revolution, right? And it happened in Cuba, and it happened in China, and it happened in, the Soviet Union and all the rest. I'm not saying that that's what has to happen here, but I think that people really are, again, to be too sociological, but really are captive of what we call false consciousness, that they really are buying into what the dominant group is telling them and blaming the group beneath them rather than the group that has power to change things. And I think that's very, very sad. Yeah?
Can you talk about the role of some of the attempts by administrations to regulate hate speech and student conduct?
Yeah. The question was comment on the role of some of the college administrations to regulate hate speech and conduct. And I actually usually mention it, and I should have, but I was worrying about time, so I skipped over it. My view, and I'm not happy with it, but it's what I think my view has to be, having thought it all through, is that you can't regulate hate speech. I think that unfortunately the speech codes that were put in place in, I believe, Michigan, Wisconsin, several major universities are indeed unconstitutional. I wish it weren't so, but I think it is so. And of course, the minute they start regulating their speech, ours will be next. Actually, usually it's ours first before anyone else's. So I think that there's good reason not to be able to regulate hate speech. Now, conduct, I think, is a very fine line. If one is inciting violence, I think that that can be in some way regulated. It's still very difficult to know how to do it. But inciting violence, I think, is the kind of behavior that is at least open to scrutiny by an administration. Certainly the examples I gave, putting a penthouse nude centerfold up on your door, was declared by that college to be protected by First Amendment rights. That student had the right to do that. These are very, very tricky issues, and having thought it through to some degree, I'm not a lawyer. Thank goodness I am not a lawyer. But I do feel that we've got to work within the constraints, obviously, of the First Amendment. And that what we have to do is try to create an environment on our college campuses where this kind of speech would be unthinkable. I think that, we've got to speak out as students, as professors, as administrators. We've got to deplore the kind of speech. I don't think that we can forbid it. I don't think we can expel people. I don't think it's productive. I think it's unconstitutional and unproductive. And I think there's tremendous backlash. You may remember the incident at Penn about a year and a half ago, where this kid screamed out of his window at midnight when there were some young women making a lot of noise out in front of the dorm, and he screamed out, "Shut up, you water buffaloes." Evidently, some people say he said, "You black water buffaloes." That's unclear because that's been muddied. I have actually been on national television opposing that and saying that it was racist, but I still don't think it can be acted upon, even though I absolutely think it was racist. I think we've got to find other ways of bringing people together and of educating these students. Yeah?
Can you take that down to a lower school level? My feeling is that kids learn a lot of bias on the playground as small children, and they're allowed to use language, and usually, particularly, they begin with against disabled children
Or girls. Or girls.
Yeah, and spastic and whatever other comments. And in talking about getting rid of bias and bigotry in the schools, we talk about limiting that language and saying that's hurtful language, don't do that. Is it free speech for the sixth graders?
Well, I think it's free speech. Technically, you can't expel them, but I think that there's nothing wrong with us you know, a fourth grade teacher saying that is hurtful language and I don't want to hear that in my classroom. I would say that. I mean, if somebody ever used language that was abusive in any way to anybody else or even spoke abusively, I don't mean abusive in a harsh sense, I mean even in a subtle way, put someone down, I would say, we don't do that here. So I think we can say that. I think that, you know, the First Amendment issues mean you can't throw them out of school. You know, you can't, you know, take a legal action.
But when they get to college, you can't talk about, or do you continue to talk about?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Go ahead, I didn't mean to interrupt. I mean, I think we definitely should talk about it. I think we should talk about what's hateful, what's hurtful, and what's hateful. I think we should talk about what effect it has on the other students. Actually, I am starting to think through, you know, more clearly that it's not only hurtful, of course, to the students who are the victims, I don't love the word, but for want of a better word, of this hate speech, but I think it's extremely hurtful to the people who are using the hate speech. To permit yourself to express yourself this way is to vent your anger in this way. It isn't any good for the kids who are doing it any more than the kids who are receiving it, and I think that should be talked about all the time. I think what we can't do probably is expel them. Yes, sorry.
I don't know if we want to get into a big debate about this subject, but as the director of the State Human Rights Agency that has enforcement powers over such issues as racial and sexual harassment, I have to base my opinion of that on a long series of court rulings that have essentially established that creating a hostile environment, working environment or an environment that place of public accommodation that is hostile based on gender or based on race is illegal. And those series of court decisions would leave me no choice but to find against an individual complained about who creates such a hostile environment and who thereby makes it impossible for the individual student to to have full enjoyment of that place of public accommodation.
Right. You're making a very important point, and I think the difference between what you're talking about and what I was responding to is that you talked about harassment, which I believe, I may be wrong, I mean, this is not my area of real expertise, is a pattern of behavior. I'm not sure, I mean, would you say that one could act on someone...
Look at a penthouse article or a penthouse picture. Centerfold is a pattern in creating a hostile environment.
What can I say?
That kind of a thing is not protected free speech.
Well, I agree that putting a penthouse nude centerfold on your door is creating a hostile environment. In that case, it was found to be protected by the First Amendment. You know, I can't really debate it. I do feel that there is a difference between a one-time, you know, shut up you water buffaloes, even though I deplore it. But I think there's a difference between a one-time shout out the window and a pattern of harassment that every time certain people walk by the fraternity house, they are screamed at or shouted at in a certain way and harassed, and a pattern of, you know, discomfort is going. I'm not sure if that makes a difference. These are very tricky issues. You know, and again, I'm not a legal person, I'm not a lawyer, but I know many of these issues were thrown out in court. And the speech codes were uniformly declared unconstitutional. So, I don't know. Any other thoughts?
You mentioned fraternity again, and I'm not in a fraternity. I don't know what it will be, but you keep on mentioning the fraternity as being either the harasser or the influencer or something.
Right.
Is that a pattern you found in college?
Yeah.
I think I've seen these fraternities being rather good about it. On this campus, is not doing anything like that.
Well, obviously, all of these things are not universal, and, you know, they're only specific to the instances. But fraternities are, I have to say, probably not at this college, at this school, with this beautiful foliage. But fraternities are known to promote a lot of these kinds of problems, in part because of the amount of alcohol that they encourage seriously on the part of their members. Virtually all of, many of the instances of sexual harassment, of certainly group rape, many of them are alcohol related, alcohol and drug related, and many of those take place in fraternities where alcohol and drugs are so freely available and where it's considered, you know, a macho thing, macho for men and for women, if that's the right word for women, to drink a tremendous amount. So that very often fraternities are singled out as, you know, sort of encouraging this kind of behavior. But it is by no means only fraternities. The first example I gave of racist writing was at Dartmouth in the Dartmouth Review, and they weren't drinking and they weren't in fraternities. They were sitting there writing their conservative newspaper, being funded by, you know, William Buckley and the Olin Foundation. You know, so I'm not certainly condemning all fraternities, but there is an increased incidence of all of this very often with alcohol and drugs. Yes?
Aside about Dartmouth, if I can, they probably were drinking because from my experience at Dartmouth, everybody always was.
Oh, okay. All right. So now we can blame the Dartmouth Review not only for all the terrible things they did, but for promoting too much liquor too. Good. Great.
The thing that I wanted to ask you about is did you come across any examples in your research of ways to defeat or ways to prevent the taking of a setback in this struggle as an utter defeat? I've seen many examples where a situation has developed where the results were not forthcoming right away, and those who were involved in the struggle on the campus took it as an utter defeat and sort of pulled it in and self-destructed. And I'd like to know if there's anybody who got a way to avoid that.
Right. Did you all hear the questions? Very interesting question. Yes, you could hear? Yeah. No? Okay. Are there any examples where students did not take a defeat and really take it as an utter defeat and sort of quit the effort because of being somewhat devastated by the setback, didn't take a setback as an utter defeat? It's a very, very interesting question, and I think it has to do with at least two things. One is our wish for an instant fix. You know, I don't think many people in social action or reform efforts or people who are trying to change the society recognize how long it takes to really make any change, and certainly young people don't. In child welfare, I try to teach them about how long it took to get a lousy child labor law in. It took 1 century to get a very inadequate child labor law in. And I tell them everything that happened for a whole century, and, you know, they're sitting there gasping because they can't imagine anything taking, you know, 6 months, much less 100 years. So I think part of it is our American desire for the quick fix and a young desire for a quick fix. I think the other part is that I think it depends on the quality of the student leadership. I met some students, and actually a lot of them I didn't even mention, who really were wonderful human beings and really took the long view and really were in it for the long haul. A student at Vassar, African-American male student at Vassar, who was head of the student association and knew the pitfalls and knew the positives and knew the negatives. And he was so well known on campus and he was so admired. In fact, he said, you know, they put him on the alumni journal, you know, the cover of the alumni journal. He said, I'm their poster child of the month. I mean, he understood the role he played. And he, in spite of his preeminence on the campus, and he was handsome, I mean, just a phenomenal guy, would be repeatedly carded. I don't know if you use that word here. Is the same word here? Okay. Asked to show his ID everywhere, you know, when he went on campus, when he needed to go into a women's dorm for an activity, he would be asked to show his ID and other people would be let in. And they said, oh, we thought you were just a kid from Poughkeepsie, the town that Vassar is located in. So this mature, caring young man who really understood it was going to take a long time kept everybody going. I think that if you've got that kind of leadership, then the students can take the setbacks and not see them as utter defeats and, you know, blow it all. I think Robert Jackson was very disappointed. He had gone the way of the establishment, trying to change from within, work with the professors, work with the administration, not march and picket and yell and scream and, you know, and he lost and he was very upset. But he was going to hang out and try some more. So I think it really depends on who's there at a certain time. And, you know, leadership comes and leadership goes, as we in the United States know only too well. So maybe I've talked long enough. Thank you very much, all of you. It's been a pleasure.